For all attendees, we're going to start in the next couple of minutes. We are starting in about 1 minute. Good morning, all, and welcome to today's event. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. My name is Eduardo Diaz, and I am the current chair of the 2021 North American School of Internet Governance, or in short, NASIG 2021. Today, I'm speaking to you from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I would like to give you a summary of yesterday's proceedings for the benefits of those that did not have a chance to participate, and as a refresher for those that did. This brief will help all of us to put in perspective today's dialogues. Yesterday, we started the day with a message from Vint Cerf. For those of you that do not know him, he is considered one of the fathers of the internet. He and Dr. Bob Clan were the creators of the internet language, or when we talk about in technical terms, they created the TCP/IP protocol that allows all devices on the internet to communicate. In his message, he mentioned that the internet has become really more relevant for many of us with the pandemic. And as many have already experienced, it allows many people to work virtually now from home, and others to continue their studies virtually and do other types of work. Just to mention a couple of examples. On the other hand, Bin said that it has also brought up some of the inefficiencies on the internet, such capacity problems, affordability for some to access the internet, and more basically, the inability of many people to not have access at all. He suggested that governments, municipalities, and local communities get involved in having people invest money in the network to resolve these inefficiencies at all levels. After that, he drilled down to some of the challenges that we are going to continue to face going forward. Things like the fact that, electrical power is essential to have a connection to the internet. If you don't have electrical power, you cannot connect to the internet. And now, once you're connected, there is the issue of technical literacy. You know, once how do I surf? How, I'm connected. What do I do? Where do I move? And then those issues about security and people understanding what passwords are so important. To be aware of internet abuses like phishing, ransomware, things like that. This has to do with education. And those are part of the issues that we're still going to continue to happen going forward. At the end of his speech, of his message, he encouraged all of us to work in collaboration to remove or mitigate internet abuse and enhance those things that are good about the internet and the things good that it provides to the world. And he mentions this should be done in collaboration with governments and all the multi-stakeholders, and it should be in a way that people can bring the issues in one place, so the end result will be a better thing to do to mitigate these things. After him, Olivier Crepin Leblanc came next and took us on what I call a magnificent magic carpet on a journey from the beginnings of the internet in the 1950s to the present. He presented various statistics, he analyzed them, and gave us sort of a score of how inclusive, trusted, and resilient the internet is these days. For the resilient part, he gave a green check mark. We are there. For the inclusive part, we are not there yet, so he gave it a red mark. No, we're not there yet. And some of the dialogues that we're going to have today, we'll have to, give more examples of things that are happening on the inclusive side. And, how much trust is on the internet? Well, he didn't give a yes or a no. We are like, we're getting there. So that means we need to get more work done to have really a trusted internet that everybody can trust. And again, this has to do with abuse of the internet, fake news, and things like that. And if you think about it, if you talk about the internet as the internet and the devices that provide the networking, it doesn't have really anything to do with the internet, but what runs on the internet. Because fake news is not internet; it's something that runs on top of it. So that was a great presentation. So I encourage all of you to go back and watch that session. And the next dialogue was moderated by our friend Glenn McKnight, and he really went down and we started talking about local communities in Canada and the work that they're performing to provide more access to the internet at all levels. So there were panelists that are actually working with communities and what they're doing and giving us the experience. Lee Rini from the P Research made a presentation about the trends on access to the internet viewed from different angles, mobile, speeds, ages, and things like that help with the presentation and some of the provide some of the basis for the discussion and some real facts that help this discussion to be rounded. And like I said, the panelists provided insights as to the work that provided good results and the challenges in moving forward the internet in their communities. So as you can see on the first day, we went from the high-level view of the internet to the end user discussing the themes of an inclusive, trusted, and resilient internet. Now, about today. Today's journey is going to continue talking about communities, and we're going to talk about abuse and the trust and the secure and stability of the internet. We will hear a panelist moderated Mark Buell around the indigenous communities in North American region and the efforts and challenges in making their community more connected. And we're going to run up today with a session moderated by Dr. Pablo Rodriguez around the issues of the stability and the security of the internet. So thank you again for being here today, and I will pass this virtual stage to our magnificent and glorious Jonathan Sock, our master of ceremony. So thank you so much, and Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Hello and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. You've heard of NASCAR. This is NASIG. So we're going to take off running and race our way through a great day. Thanks, Eduardo, for the introduction and the summary of yesterday's sessions. Today, we're going to start off with a discussion of the digital divide and the implications for indigenous and tribal communities and what effect, both positive and negative, the internet has had on those communities and how the situation could be made even better. Mark Buell, who's the moderator of the session, is the vice president for North America of the Internet Society. But before that, worked in healthcare, in tribal healthcare. So one of the big areas for use of the internet is in health, remote healthcare, making it into rural areas and elsewhere. So I'm really excited to hear this panel discussion. So without further ado, Mark Buell, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to the organizers of the NASIG. This really is a great event. I've been before, and I think these schools on internet governance are excellent. I'm actually a graduate of the European School on Internet Governance. In this session, we're going to speak about connectivity in indigenous communities in North America. So while the digital divide is often characterized as a developed versus developing world issue, the fact remains that there is a persistent digital divide in Canada and the United States. And that divide is most prevalent in the rural and remote areas of the continent. So as such, indigenous communities are disproportionately affected. In this session, we're going to explore what the current situation is, what some of the challenges are, and also talk about some of the success stories. There are some real bright lights in both Canada and the US. We're joined by a great group of speakers, including Loris Taylor from Native Public Media, H. Trossel from the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University, Jessica Engel from the Yurok tribe in the Western United States, and Sally Braun from the Western James Bay Telecom Network. I think we'll have time for questions at the end, but I think it'd be best to just dig right in and start off with you, Jessica. You're from a community that is in the very early stages of deploying a community network. Can you tell us about the Yurok tribe's experience, what access currently looks like, what it means for community members to have poor or non-existent access, and what efforts you've undertaken in the past to get connectivity? Jessica?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Share my screen. I'm a visual person, so I always feel like I need to show the map of where we are, because it's part of the reason why this is so, I feel like, critical, is that we are in Northern California, the most northern region of California near the Oregon border. So the Yurok Reservation follows the Klamath River from the mouth of the Klamath up 44 miles, I think it's 46 miles now with some of the efforts being made, but and 1 mile on each side of that river. The white border here on this map is the ancestral lands. The red border is the federally recognized reservation boundary. And the thing about this is that there is no infrastructure anywhere north of Trinidad, which is just at the base of our ancestral lands. There's a water body there that the providers from the south would have not crossed, and there is nothing in the north. So we've had to bring our internet in wirelessly from Crescent City through an 18-mile over water wireless link and build out a tower network on the reservation over time. And that tower network was limited based on the number or the bandwidth we were able to purchase in Crescent City, which was 400 megabits. So to give you that perspective, there's 921 address points within the red reservation boundaries. But that does not include the ancestral lands or anything in between Trinidad and Crescent City. So it's not a whole lot of bandwidth to be spread around all the tribal offices and small businesses, as well as any sort of emergency communications. And so, beginning at the beginning of the pandemic, it was pretty evident that if we wanted to send people home to work and go to school, that we needed to be able to provide some means of internet. And so we had to upgrade some of our existing equipment and fight to get additional bandwidth from providers. And, it just really highlighted all of the reasons that the internet is so important. We've had some emergencies that we just could not respond to, or folks would have to stand and watch their home burn down because there's no way to call for help. The accidents on the highway that takes way too long to get emergency notification out. But then going into the pandemic, students just cannot go to school. And if their parent is trying to connect to, a small little bit of internet to work from or to make a call from, because there also isn't telephone service, then the children aren't going to be able to connect to Zoom and do their classroom work. In some instances, we would have kids in the parking lot of a tribal office trying to connect to Wi-Fi to do their schoolwork because they couldn't do it from home. Outcomes are really poor in this region of Northern California. And there's been a suicide crisis that's related to not having access to simple things like the internet. So moving forward, it's, my first step was to try and get providers interested enough to take this on. But it's a really rural area that's mostly tribal lands, and it isn't populated enough, and the income's not high enough to make it incentivized for a provider to come in and bring the infrastructure through their means. And so I had to try and do it myself through piecing together small grants and in various ways to get what we were able to get completed. Fortunately, with the infrastructure bill, there might be an opportunity to fund some additional build outs, but it was very obvious that we were going to have to do it all ourselves. And the community network aspect of it is something that wasn't previously known to me. And, the Internet Society put on a boot camp where I went and I learned a lot about community networks. And now we're able to serve an entire region of the reservation that we couldn't reach before, just because we didn't think to use someone's home as a relay point and make it a community type of solution. And so that's exciting, and getting people involved and working on it together has created this movement on the reservation where people are excited and they can't wait to do more to get access in, because it's a solution that's being as a community. So lots of work, but it's nice to see the excitement and the momentum building. And I'm hoping to see that on the other side of this digital divide, that we can come out of this, high rates of suicide and poor educational outcomes and homelessness and poverty, and bring back some strength to this community.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Sally. Sally, you're part of a very well-established and large network in Canada. Can you tell us about the Western James Bay Telecom Network, what it does, who it serves, why it was established?
Okay, and did you want me to go into the challenges later, Mark?
You can go into the challenges now if you'd like, Sally. That would be great.
Sure. Okay, well, first of all, kudos to Jessica. I'm so impressed with what she's doing, and it's so important to have a champion like Jessica serving in regions that are underserved. The Western James Bay Telecom Network has been operating since 2010 in Treaty 9 territory, which is located on the west side of James Bay in Ontario, Canada. That's at about 51 degrees latitude north. It's 270 kilometers of fiber optic backbone, which runs from Moosonee to Attawapiskat. It runs on a sky wire over hydro poles owned by our sister corporation, which is Five Nations Energy, Inc. And both companies came into being as a result of diamonds being found 90 kilometers west of Attawapiskat, and the power was required by De Beers to operate the mine. So in 2000, the Mushkegowuk Council, which is the tribal council representing 7 First Nations, and the tribal council Western James Bay operates under, they were the community champion and project sponsor to undertake the development of our network. And we were able to do a feasibility study to bring broadband connectivity to the remote First Nation communities of Fort Albany, Kasheshwan, and Attawapiskat. And the feasibility study was completed in October of 2002. Fast forward 20 years, and we now deliver fiber internet connectivity to hospitals, schools, health centers, band offices, airports, etc. in our region. We also provide back office logistical support and training to several community-based technicians who look after 720 wireless residential customers in the 3 First Nations. When I started, we were at 60 megabits per second at our gateway in Moosonee. We are now at 5 gigs. So we've escalated very fast, which goes to the point that it doesn't matter how much broadband you offer, you're always going to need more. We've been working on a major telecommunications project since 2014. The main objective of the project is to improve the residential internet connection speed to homes to meet the federal standards, and also, and most importantly, to serve as an economic springboard to lift this entire region out of poverty. Just about 75% of the people in this region are on social assistance in some form or another. The employment rate is very high. And like Jessica, we have had issues with suicides, opioid overdoses, and we're desperately concerned about our youth and wanting to provide them with the best possible infrastructure so they can achieve their what they would like to do with their lives. I should mention that the Five Nations Energy, Inc. and Western James Bay Telecom Network were the first in Canada, 100% Indigenous owned. One is an energy transmission provider, and Western James Bay is a internet service provider. So we were the first. There's been many come along since, but we were the first. The fiber to the home construction season began in 2019 and is scheduled for completion in September 2022, COVID permitting. We are connecting about 1,200 homes in the communities to fiber to the home. When COVID hit in 2020, we were fortunate because we at least had all our materials in the community so we could get the work done. other projects in other part of the country were not so fortunate, as the pandemic's supply chain issues caused work to come to a standstill. COVID hit not once, but 3 times, and these repeated lockdowns wreaked havoc on our construction schedule. The pressure to get the fiber to the home project completed came from all directions, as everyone was trying to cope with working from home with poor connectivity. So there was enormous pressure on the staff and you know, the people I work with and myself, from the chiefs and leadership in these communities to get the job done. But on the other hand, we were basically locked out. We couldn't send a construction crew in. The challenges that I just wanted to touch on, I can talk on about them later because I don't want to take up too much time. The challenges that I'm noticing are lack of leadership, dark fiber availability right across Canada. This is an issue. And in the past, we have looked to our political and business leaders to do the right thing by us. But in the last few years, I've come to realize that there are times when these leaders are not the persons who should be in the forefront of internet infrastructure development, as the business models they are bound to and the regulations they must adhere to do not allow for altruistic goals to be achieved. To get this into perspective, I use the example of how our schools were built in Canada in the 1800s. Our schools were built wherever a child lived. So how do we deliver connectivity to each child in Canada? Amadeo Bernardi touched on this point yesterday when he spoke about large sums of money to the government that the government was allocating to remote and rural communities, which were so desperate for connectivity that they would settle for a solution which was not optimal in the long term. What is not optimal is that even if the infrastructure is deployed in a community, what then? Can you afford the price, the bandwidth you're going to require? Is the bandwidth you need available? Canadian ISPs pay the highest rates for bandwidth compared to the States. What is needed in Northern Ontario is more lit fiber optic capacity terminating at an internet exchange point at the US border, where bandwidth can be purchased for a fraction of what we are being forced to pay now. This means more fiber must be laid, and I do not believe that for-profit companies have any interest in doing this, as the return on investment falls outside their business model. And the government rarely undertakes projects for the common good that interfere with a for-profit business. Second challenge that I see and that we're facing is the environmental risks. In the past few years, our infrastructure has experienced outages due to flooding, HVAC failures due to unseasonably high temperatures, and fire. During these events, we have always done our best to mitigate the harm these events can cause to our clients. And we see it all across Canada now. Like we're seeing it in BC now, floods in Alberta a few years ago, the floods in Manitoba. So it's happening everywhere. And in order for your network to be resilient, you have to build in mechanisms that are going to show that you are doing due diligence and that you are trying to deliver the service that you are promising. The other issue, a challenge that I see has to do with energy policies and what is being done to put the brakes on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions the internet is now emitting into the atmosphere. It is estimated that by the year 2030 or 2035, the internet is going to be using 35% of the global energy output. The fourth area that I see there is a problem is how our spectrum allocation policy in Canada is set up. It is set up in such a way that is putting the health and safety of our citizens at risk on the land where you have large for-profit companies buying up huge chunks of spectrum that they are not going to use. They basically put it on the shelf. They look at where they can get the most profit, which are densely occupied population centers, and they just leave the rest of us out without any sort of support as we go out onto the land. And we've had several hunters die for this reason, and we've had several hunters that if they were able to use a cell phone, they would be alive today. So that's what I have to say, Mark. So thank you very, very much to everyone for this opportunity to join in this session.
Thank you, Sally. I think one thing that you touched on, I think we'll raise later, and that's around spectrum and what needs to be done with that regard. But we'll turn to you, Loris. Can you speak about the policy and legislative environment for tribal areas in the US? What are the particular challenges you see for tribal communities? And if you can also raise some of the opportunities, perhaps.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of NASIG. I've been with Native Public Media since 2004 and have led this organization in terms of providing broadcasting to tribal lands. I've also been the co-chair of the telecommunications subcommittee for the National Congress of American Indians, sat on a few FCC committees, and a member of NORALO, the North American Regional at-Large organizations, and also just a recent graduate of NASIG. So if you haven't taken NASIG as a course, you should do it. It's an excellent program. But let me start out by talking about in the indigenous North Americas, and primarily the US. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and I'm a homegirl to the Hopi and Acoma reservations, so Gowatsi, Nkwangtalengva. I have a familiarity with the subtle tribal nuances that intersect with technology. Having been raised on the tribal reservation of the Hopi in the village of Aribi, where we had no running water, no electricity, absolutely no internet, no television, no radio. So I've come a long way. It's a wonder that I'm a poster child for broadcasting today. The subtle nuances of tribal lifestyles and understanding the culture is very important to the policy making of Indian tribes in the US. So for example, US tribal governance is constituted through a variety of legislative enactments, including treaties, federal public law, and even state recognition. And this makes a difference in the deployment of the internet or broadband across tribal lands. NPM's mission is to promote the self-determination of indigenous peoples through media access, storytelling, and ownership. So let me just talk a little bit about the US Native Broadcast Network. Broadcasting really was my entry into the world of broadband and the internet. We work directly with terrestrial radio and television stations, which is a highly regulated industry in the US and a really huge user of licensed spectrum. We have 59 radio stations and 3 television stations located on tribal reservations, and over half of these stations stream their signal over the internet, reaching audiences around the world. Only one station is located off tribal homelands, and all the stations are licensed to tribal governments or tribal entities. And Native Public Media represents the interests of this Native Broadcast Network to Congress and federal agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Aviation Administration, the General Accountability Office, and others. So that's been my world. That's where I started. In 2009, just a few years after I started Native Public Media, we published our first study titled The New Media Technology and Internet Use Study in Indian Country. This was really our first look at how tribes are using the internet. We interviewed hundreds of people across Indian Country and focused on at least 4 tribes. So as a result of this partnership that we had with the New America Foundation back then, we laid out a really clear set of recommendations for inclusion in the US National Broadband Plan, which had never been done before. And I just want to highlight some of the recommendations that we focused on back in the day. So this broadband plan really came out in 2010. And one of our huge goals was to make sure that we had a tribal broadband plan embedded in the national federal broadband plan, a huge undertaking. So we knew that we had to have very solid recommendations. I'm not going to go over all of them, but if you look up the 2020 National Broadband Plan, you'll see the tribal recommendations there, which we worked very hard to include into the plan. But one of the things I want to mention was that we recommended that the FCC create a tribal office within their institution that would work with the sovereign nations within the United States. Now, if you know anything about the FCC, the offices are siloed. So you'll have the Media Bureau, you'll have the Enforcement Bureau. So all these bureaus are in these silos. And so when you go to Washington, D.C., and let's say you're talking about tower siting, you have to meet with several of these bureaus. And if you're not familiar with the workings of the FCC, you may visit one bureau, come all the way back to the reservation in Arizona, and find that you have to meet with additional bureaus. And so to reduce that and to make sure that there was a solid working relationship between the federal government and tribes, under the cloak of meaningful tribal consultation, we felt that an office within the FCC was the right way to go. I'm very happy to say that it's one of the few items that I know that was instituted right away. The Office of Native Affairs and Policy at the FCC is a result of the recommendations in 2010. We also had recommendations regarding spectrum. One was to provide an increased access to spectrum for tribes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we also made sure that we were focused on the FCC adopting a tribal priority for spectrum, really high on the list. As you know, in the US, the federal government is the only sovereign that allocates spectrum across the country. We also wanted to establish a tribal priority for broadband funding. And imagine this is before COVID, right? And before we even got to this point, we now have several pots of money, as you know, for broadband across Indian Country. Let me talk a little bit about some of the highlights of our policy focus. One is on data, and I know that we have a person here that's going to talk a little bit more about research, I'm sure. But I just want to talk to you about why it's important to focus on data. As you know, that under the current FCC reporting protocols, the FCC considers a census block served if a single residence in that block has access to broadband. And this overstatement of broadband availability, which also uses maximum advertised, not actual speeds as part of their data collection, really skews how tribes how tribes can participate in getting funding for broadband. So, for example, an area that's considered served or not can have a really significant effect on their eligibility for federal broadband infrastructure support. So if there's inaccurate or overstated data, it prevents businesses and governments and other entities from securing federal funds to assist underserved and underserved communities, and that's really talking about Indian country. Tribes and other rural entities also face additional burdens in applying for and managing federal funds due to excessive application and reporting procedures, and that's happening right now. A lot of tribes that have these massive amounts of dollars that are earmarked for Indian country, but there are also very steep requirements that tribes are finding very hard to fulfill. For example, some of the grants have a significant match or cash on hand requirements, and this can really stifle tribal government's effort in broadband deployment. Now, something that both the two speakers before, Jessica and Sally, they really, I think, highlighted what it means to be high cost areas across Indian country and in Canada, where tribal lands are considered high cost, primarily because it costs so much to deploy broadband across tribal homelands. The FCC's 2020 broadband deployment report estimated that 27.7% of Americans that reside on tribal lands lacked fixed terrestrial broadband coverage, compared to 22.3% of Americans in rural areas and 1.5% in urban areas. And in a separate report, the 2018, all this is pre-COVID, the GAO office asserted that the FCC overstates broadband coverage on tribal lands, which is no surprise to us at all. So there are a number of barriers, again, that Jessica and Sally already hit on, and why deployment barriers are so huge across tribal lands. Now, this picture is from the Navajo Reservation, which was really hit hard by COVID-19 and now followed by the Delta virus. Most tribal lands in the US are rural, remote. They have rugged terrain. These areas are sometimes not connected to a road system, which was my reservation. There are no street names out there because there are dirt roads. There are minimal access to middle mile and long haul fiber optic cables. There's a lot of dark fiber, I know, across the US, but certainly on tribal lands, we don't have those readily available. And there are also difficulties in obtaining rights of way to deploy infrastructure across tribal lands. We have to remember that tribes are constituted in different ways different ways, and these factors can really increase the cost of installing, maintaining, and upgrading infrastructure. And so long before pre-COVID, tribes were already facing these challenges, and they were already also had the challenge of securing funds through the federal broadband deployment programs. In fact, in 2018, a separate GAO report found that from 2010 to 2017, less than 1% of funding went directly to tribes or tribally owned providers. And that's huge. And look at what's happening today. So while we were used to scarcity, now we have an overabundance, I think, of funding, which we're trying to manage. So
internet speed matters.
Okay, she likes to talk. So let me just talk about the speed, which is really, I think, critical today. I think COVID really unveiled some structural flaws in businesses and in our schools and government, and that if we're to promote economic prosperity and diversity, broadband speed is really critical to telehealth, to remote working, to distance learning, agriculture, everything that we do, even to our electrical grids. And we're finding that the federal standard of 25 megabits per second and 3 on the download and upload is really not enough to meet the requirements of what we need today. The speed definition doesn't correspond with the download and upload speeds that are necessary to support education, for example. And once again, I think Sally and Jessica, you both mentioned this. It doesn't correspond to healthcare applications. If you look at Alaska, for example, where the Alaska Natives are very remote, and sometimes they live in villages where the only way to get in is by air, who would benefit from telehealth can't do it because they don't have the necessary infrastructure, and most of all, they need the bandwidth to be able to do what they need. And so we support from Native Public Media a higher scalable standard that more accurately reflects modern innovations and bandwidth demands. In terms of spectrum, in 2010, as I mentioned, we worked with the FCC to establish the first tribal priority for broadcast. And this was really meant to expand the number of radio stations owned by tribes broadcasting to tribal lands. More recently, that tribal priority was the basis for the tribal priority for the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum window that was focused on rural tribal lands in the US. Now, the 2.5 window was a unique opportunity for tribes in rural areas to directly access unassigned spectrum over their tribal lands. And even though they were subject to build-out requirements that were quite steep in some cases, this was the first real opportunity to get our hands on spectrum for both mobile coverage and fixed point-to-point uses, and to provide broadband service by educational licenses and commercial providers that lease the spectrum. So this really played a huge role in the deployment of broadband. The unfortunate thing is that it happened right during COVID, the break, when COVID was beginning to surge. And so even though we asked the FCC to extend the window some additional 180 days, it was a very limited window for tribes, but fortunately we had a lot of tribes who applied for the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, and we're looking and petitioning the FCC to open additional windows for tribes. Now, let me just talk by talking about moving the dial. And again, the two speakers before mentioned some of these ideals. I think we need to help the least connected in the country and around the world to connect to affordable high-speed broadband. It really is the technology of today. I think discrimination has no part in broadband deployment. We should not be discriminated against because we geographically might be located in a place that's hard to get to. Everybody has a need for broadband, and that was really stark and polarized during COVID-19. We went through a very information-centric pandemic, which I think is going to become an endemic, which means it's going to be here for a very long time. And for someone whose industry was considered essential in combating and fighting against COVID-19 and now promoting vaccination, we are an essential institution. We have issues around First Amendment rights as well, which is a real huge focus of Native Public Media. And that leads me to my other point, which is to restore net neutrality in the United States. We want the internet to be open and free for everyone, anyone, anywhere, at any time. We also, and this is what Sally also pointed out, there's no one-size-fits-all business model that's the right approach for Indian country or First Nations. Tribes across the country are developing hybrid models. They should be encouraged to do so. There's also a need for continued dedicated funding and spectrum for broadband across Indigenous communities. The need is there. It's not going to be all deployed and in place in relatively short time with all the funding that's available. And I want to end by just saying that broadband must be universal. It has to be ubiquitous to close the digital divide in Indian country. And that's been our message to Congress and our stakeholders and others that are policymakers at the table, and that will continue to be our message. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Loris. That was very good. One thing I'd like to reinforce from what you said, because I think it's critical, but it's also very, very basic. You spoke about the diversity of Indigenous peoples in the US, and I think we need to keep that in mind all the time. In Canada, there are 3 constitutionally recognized Indigenous peoples: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. All have a different relationship with the government, all have their own unique priorities. And among First Nations, there's more than 600 individual First Nations in Canada, and everyone is unique and has their own characteristics, their own needs, their own desires. And geography plays a role too. In North America, a lot of northern communities are satellite dependent and will likely be satellite dependent for years to come. But it can go from the most remote community to we're working with an Indigenous organization in the north end of Winnipeg, a city of more than 600,000 people, to build access into a predominantly Indigenous neighborhood, because it doesn't exist. So I think that's worth remembering. And you raised a number of points I think we'll hopefully have a chance to revisit. H, I know we know each other, and I know that you have a very unique perspective as someone who's worked for a variety of organizations, including one that supported local level initiatives, and now you're at a major policy research organization at Arizona State University. Can you tell us what needs to happen next for Indigenous communities to be able to drive their own connectivity solutions on their own terms?
Yes, definitely. And I'm going to focus on what Loris was ending with talking about how we need to help the least connected get access to affordable broadband. Specifically, what do people do with it once they have it? We've definitely heard stories of people who get access to technology and then don't immediately use it because they don't understand all of the ways that they can use it and how it could impact their life. So I'm going to share my screen here. So I very much see digital inclusion as the second piece of digital equity, where we need to have access first. And that is something that we have all been talking about so much here, is how in many cases we don't even have access. But we also need to recognize that as we're building out these networks, we need to also be in a role of widening digital inclusion and providing more resources to everyone. So just a little bit about my current workplace. I work at the American Indian Policy Institute out of Arizona State University. We are a research institute. It's non-teaching. It is tribally driven participatory research. So that means that we work specifically to make sure we are meeting the needs of tribes as they tell us, rather than trying to guess what people want. We attend the consultations that have been happening. We have an advisory board that provides us with information, and our research is participatory. So for instance, we are doing a report about the wireless boot camp that Jessica mentioned, and making sure that we are documenting that and explaining what things that academia can do to support Native nations. Today, I'm going to talk about my positionality and approach to research, a little bit about the federal government, some about local initiatives, and then really focus on the work ahead. So I am a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I'm Two-Spirit. I use they, them pronouns. I have been working in the broadband field for about 7 years now. I started out at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, really looking at local initiatives. But even before that, I was volunteering as a teacher for English language learners and helping them get connected to the internet, set up email accounts, recognize spam, phishing, all of those sort of dangers that exist on the internet. I also grew up far from Cherokee Nation. And so one of the major things for me has been connecting with other Cherokee people and Cherokee culture through the online initiatives that Cherokee Nation has. So, taking language classes online, as well as, doing, just recently I did a online class on how to make moccasins, like Cherokee Peckertail moccasins. So sort of experiencing all of the possibilities of the internet as far as like language and culture preservation. I also really focus on the getting information from advocates for better.
I think H has frozen. Oh,
Am I back?
You're back. Yes.
Okay, it cut out for a second. I have a fiber connection, but sometimes it's a little unstable in the mornings. Yeah, where did I cut at? I was, yeah, go ahead.
Your research approach, I think it would be good to be there.
Okay. Yeah, so with my research approach, I really focus on talking to advocates, talking to practitioners, reading further into the academic research that is coming out and seeing how it can apply in Indian country, if it can apply in Indian country, because we know there is no one size fits all approach here. And so being able to talk to people like Sally, talk to people like Jessica, Loris, in order to fully make sure we are encompassing as many voices as possible when developing research. So we have seen recently at the federal government that there is now more funding for digital inclusion available. There is now an interest in subsidizing internet access because, as Laura's pointed out, a lot of it is unaffordable. I talked a little bit about the opportunities for language preservation. The federal government is very interested in supporting those. They recently passed like a memorandum of understanding at the Tribal Nations Summit just the other day. And they are much more involved in the federal government is much more involved in consultations and developing this nation-to-nation relationship and respecting it. I specifically want to point out that in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that recently passed, there is a digital equity competitive grant. And this makes $250 million available for each of the first 5 fiscal years. And what this can do is that tribes are eligible entities to apply for this. It does not sound like there are any matching fund requirements for this grant. And this builds off the work of the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, which that program provided funding both for infrastructure, but also for digital inclusion work. And so with local initiatives, so sort of going through all the different levels, Right now, I'm very much focused on the federal level, but local initiatives I can talk a little bit about because of my previous work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and my current volunteer work as well. So we have community networks prioritizing connecting community spaces and making sure that the entire community gets access in some way to internet services. I saw a great example over at Mohawk Networks of connecting the Boys and Girls Club, which at the same time got funding for better computers and focused on teaching those digital literacy skills. Right now, I volunteer at an after-school program, and a lot of that is teaching computer skills to youth so that they know how to use it when they want to go to college or when they are forced to do online learning. So that has been one of the things that has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen students have to learn really quickly how to get the full capabilities out of the computers that they were given, especially here in the urban school districts. We have, I saw a program out of Fond du Lac in reservation in Minnesota that was teaching youth to develop apps for language and culture preservation. So they were working with elders and with language experts in order to develop programs and build digital skills, while also, building that intergenerational relationships and building up the possibilities of getting more involved. Related to that, I've seen amazing initiatives that give elders iPads in order to better connect them. Because one of the things that we found with the survey that the American Indian Policy Institute did back in 2019, the Tribal Technology Assessment, we found that the main way to access the internet was smartphones. And iPads are very similar to smartphones. They are touch screens, they are larger devices, so it's easier for the elderly to read. And so we've also seen on the local level maker spaces. So this gives everyone in the community access to some of the newer technologies that people can use for different kinds of crafting. So one of the things that I've seen at maker spaces is 3D printers. And it is really cool to see people who have very little access to the internet make something using this new technology and be able to take it home with them. So these are some of the local initiatives, and this really brings us to the work ahead. Like I said, here at the American Indian Policy Institute, our research is tribally driven and participatory. And I think that should be a goal of pretty much all research in Indian country, that it should be tribally driven. It should be drawing from members of the community. It should be producing useful outcomes for them. It shouldn't be research for research's sake. Additionally, we have seen with some of the conversations at the federal level that tribal libraries need to be fully eligible for the internet access subsidies. Right now, it can be a little difficult to get tribal libraries connected. And these are community spaces that would be great starting points to getting the community connected and fully interested in all the possibilities of the technology. Additionally, the digital inclusion curricula should be adapted for each community. Like I said, there's no one size fits all solution. One of the very common ones right now is the North Star curriculum, but that was made in Minnesota. It's for a very specific Minnesota context. And additionally, as we get people connected, we should not just be consumers of content, but also producers of content. But we must be careful about what goes on the internet. I've seen amazing work this last month for Native American Heritage Month on TikTok of the different young people sharing their culture, sharing their pride in their culture. But I've also seen missteps of sharing things that should not be shared outside the community. And I think that some of these programs that connect the elders to the youth through technology is a great way to try to prevent that from happening, to try to make sure that the whole community is represented and, not basically to not have information you don't want shared outside your community end up on the internet. So those are sort of the work ahead. We need to get people connected, like with the internet access first. We need to make sure that everyone fully knows how to use the internet to the best of their ability, how to use new technologies, and to connect youth and elders, and to make sure that that we are fully using the internet to its best ability. So thank you. That was all I had to share. This is a link to the Tribal Broadband Resource page we've been putting together at the American Indian Policy Institutes. And this is my contact information, and I'm happy to share these slides afterwards.
Great, thank you, H. That was very interesting. Yeah, so one thing that's come up in just about every discussion for the past year and a half or so is COVID, and it's come up a few times in our discussions here. Both Jessica and Sally mentioned how COVID shone a bright light on the importance of internet access for community well-being. And we have seen policymakers and funders respond to COVID. But, and I'll post this question to all of you, has the pandemic spurred a response from policymakers and funders that can or will be effective to address the divide that exists in Indigenous communities? Have you seen any programs or policies that have emerged over the past few months that can really make a difference? I know it's a bit of a leading question since the $1.2 billion infrastructure package was just passed, and it had $65 billion for access. But please, have you seen anything that has changed that can really make a difference?
For me, it's the emergency broadband benefit program, giving the tribally owned and operated WISPs an opportunity to access a subsidy like that, that normally is only for telephone service or telephone providers that are designated and regulated. So I would say that program, although it's been a huge burden because there was no administrative support, and that was our first time doing something like that, like I myself have had to do a lot of work to get the folks enrolled and registered. There's some flaws with the system in getting the tribal lands piece subsidy, but right now we have close to 220 customers, and 137 are signed up and receiving either the lower non-tribal lands $50 a month bill credit, or the higher 75 a month bill credit. I'm really excited too to hear that the infrastructure bill passed, because that adds funds to that, changing the name to Affordable Broadband Program. And I did the extra legwork to get approval to use our own alternative verification instead of having to use the universal service verification. That was just not going to happen. In order for you to register someone, you had to they had to be eligible in that system first. And because tribal lands aren't registered with like Google Maps, there's a lot of trouble getting that piece. It took too long to get the eligibility verification piece done. And so I'm really just over the moon excited that we were approved for not having to do that. But we also included a device component, because that program included, you could do a tablet or a laptop, and the FCC would reimburse $100 towards the device, and the customer had to pay more than $10 but less than $50, which was so strange. So I found a tablet, a really good tablet, for $110 from our vendors, and I ordered a bunch of them before I even got the program going, so that we would have them on hand, and so that our customers have to pay $10.01, because it has to be more than $10. But it's worked out really well, and I'm excited to be able to do that, because a lot of the prohibitions from getting access to internet, especially in high cost areas, is we can't give it away for free. We have to charge for it, and because the cost of bandwidth is so high, that price is not very reasonable. And so being able to provide a solution that is free or close to free. For premium internet, it's $84 a month regular. And if they're on the reservation lands, they're only paying $9 a month now. So it's a big difference. And I'm really grateful for that component. I will say, though, with all the federal funding that's coming out for broadband, it's not going to solve the whole issue. There's a ton of gaps in what is eligible to be used. Like, the administrative costs alone are huge. And, I'm with the largest tribe in the largest state in the United States, and we're 95% grant funded. We can't afford the administrative burden that is, applying for these grants, managing them, getting the contractors, the legal, all of the indirect costs basically related to these grants. And most of the infrastructure funding that's coming through does not have a lot of room for that. And so that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. And hopefully those of us that are doing these big lifts without that support are not going to burn out before we finish. That's like my current mantra: don't burn out, don't burn out. You got to keep going.
Thank you. Sally Loris H., have you seen anything that will truly make a difference?
I have. I think there are a couple of things that have resulted from as a result of COVID-19. One, it unveiled the structural flaws in electricity, in broadband, in PPEs. I mean, the list is really long that we've been talking about in regards to tribal homelands. And all of a sudden, everybody's woke, as they say, to the issues. So the other thing is that I feel that tribes have been positioned, by choice or not, to have a conversation about broadband, because it's here. And some of the most, I think, substantial conversations that I'm hearing are around what tribes are wanting to see as a result of this huge response in terms of broadband, funding for broadband deployment, adoption, even for laptops, as Jessica just mentioned. So for one, tribes have talked about self-certifying where they are served in terms of broadband. Now, that's a reverse from allowing the federal government to lead that initiative. So that's a whole reversal. Tribes are basically saying, we'll do it ourselves. We'll be the authority on whether tribal lands are served, unserved, or underserved. And that's a paradigm shift there. There's also big conversations about what sorts of mechanisms are going to be supportive of the deployment on tribal homelands. And they're looking at governance as a way to do that. So tribes are saying, like, perhaps that any applicant that's seeking funding to build infrastructure on tribal lands should have a resolution of support from the appropriate tribal government in order to be eligible. This is to do away, I mean, when you have tons of money, there are people that come out from all sorts of networks. And so I think tribes are also trying to manage this onslaught of resources and assets to their tribal communities. Then they're looking at other things, codifying tribal laws so that there's compliance between tribal laws and the regulations from the federal side in terms of loan and grant agreements. That's a good conversation to have, because if you have gaps, as someone already mentioned, those gaps need to be filled, but they should be filled in a way that serves the tribal interests. And there's also, tribes are also having a conversation around whether any of these funding or any of these programs limit tribal self-government. So in order for sovereigns, you're a sovereign if you exercise your sovereignty. I mean, it's as strong as you can make it if you exercise that sovereignty. And so the fact that they're now serving as their own watchdogs, and they're looking at ways that this may diminish tribal self-government, that's a good place to be. So I think overall, even though there are numerous amounts of challenges, I just was on a conversation a couple of weeks ago where the federal agencies now have tribal representatives in nearly every federal agency. That's unprecedented. That's like in my lifetime. I mean, I've been advocating since 2004. So for many, many years, I was talking to empty chairs and talking to people who didn't feel that we even existed or mattered. But all of a sudden, we have representatives in federal agencies who are coordinating their efforts. That's wonderful to see people that come from our homelands, that look like us, who understand those tribal nuances. Extremely important, because at the end of the day, we may have all this funding, but if we don't have good structural support and policies that are tethered to those structural supports, then we may be a step back by the time the dust clears. And so I'm hoping that's not the case, but I feel like we're on strong footing at this point in time.
Well, thank you. Before I go to H and Sally, one thing we always say at the Internet Society is, if you're building a community network, the network part is the hard part. The network part is the easy part. The technical part of a network is the easy part. The hard part is the human part, the community part, the building the community around the network, and the governance. The governance has to be in place. The right policies need to be there. H or Sally, any thoughts on policies or programs that you see might work?
One of the things that I've noticed in the past year has been the federal government sort of doing away with those matching funds requirements, which makes things a little bit easier to access those federal funds. But as Jessica pointed out, there's still all those administrative costs that goes with any time you get a loan or grant. We've also seen some loan programs basically turn into grant programs, like with the USDA Reconnect program. So there are these sort of small changes that we've been asking for a while. Will they make a big enough impact? I'm not sure, but I think there is also been this growing movement of different, IT people and tribal leaders, and also philanthropy organizations and foundations finally being in the same room as each other and almost talking like the same language now. So that has been huge throughout the COVID-19 pandemic.
So true. Sally, I think in Canada, things are a little different. There hasn't been a massive announcement of money. There is money out there. And what seems to be happening is a little bit piecemeal. But are there anything you see on the horizon happening in Canada? I think from my perspective, I can think of Canada ratifying the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and some kind of commitment on implementing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And hopefully that will result in some of the things Loris was talking about that's happening in the US. But have you seen anything in Canada?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on a point that Loris made. And when COVID hit, the government was very quick to say that they would be supportive of Canadian citizens. And what I noticed in my territory, which is our governing body is the Anishinaabe Nation. There's 49 First Nations that are a member of this organization. And what I noticed is who wasn't at the table when decisions were being made about how this money was going to be spent. For example, we had the Ministry of Justice saying, oh, well, we can do courts virtually, without there being anyone at the table to say, in order to do that, you need the connectivity in the communities, and there wasn't anyone. In the case of Anishinaabe Nation, they had no one running the IT advisory, nothing. They pulled 2 people from housing and transportation, and that's the desk it landed on. So for Western James Bay, and KNET, which is also operating in Northern Ontario, we spent a lot of time talking to the people that were making the decisions, the politicians, the ministries, the civil servants, and advising them on what was possible, what is possible, and the challenges to what they were proposing, and how to get over those. So it's running the internet is not easy. It's not an easy ride. There's so many things going on, so many factors to consider, and I think it's been a sort of a learning session for all of us. And I'll go back to what I said earlier, and that is sometimes the politicians and the for-profit companies are not the people that should be handling this. They really don't know. This is not a business that you can run like a railroad or run like a road system. This is very, very different. So what I'm seeing is a colonial mindset and model being applied to a situation that is very, very new. And the terrain is largely uncharted. So it's going to be a learning curve for everyone. And right now, the politicians handle the money. So they're the ones that basically need to be schooled.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. So please post your questions in the chat. But before we go to questions from participants, I'll pose one more question to each of you. We've talked a lot about funding. We've talked a lot about money. But money is one thing, but it's certainly not the only thing. From your perspective, what do you think is the top priority for Indigenous communities to achieve digital parity with their non-Indigenous counterparts in North America? One thing. If anyone wants to go first, otherwise I'll call someone's name.
I mean, first for us would be access. That's the biggest challenge, is that we can serve some folks. Of the 921 addresses, we have about 230 that have some sort of connectivity. And I wouldn't say that they're served. 5 megabit connection doesn't really do a whole lot. But the rest of the reservation doesn't have power, lacks water sometimes during the, this past summer was a drought year, and the water system was drying up for our village. And you need those, and then internet. And then the folks that we were able to connect that don't have power, when they would turn their generator off at the end of the day, the internet would go away as well. And so we would get alerts on our system and like, oh no, this whole village is down. But no, they just turned their generators off. We have a funny problem, but yeah, access is first.
Laura, Sally?
I would say that the gold standard has always been meaningful tribal consultation. There has to be a conversation between the federal government and even the state government with tribal nations so that they can arrive at how deployment will occur. For tribal lands, the lines have to go over several jurisdictions. So if you can imagine, you're crossing you need state right-of-ways, you may need federal right-of-ways, you may need an intertribal right-of-way. So there has to be meaningful tribal consultation. And that also applies to the providers. They hold the majority of the spectrum in this country, and the pipelines start there. So there has to be meaningful consultation with providers. There has to be meaningful consultation with the policymakers, which includes Congress. All of it, you can have tribal consultation, but it has to be meaningful, it has to be equal, and there has to be some reciprocation from both sides to get to that point where deployment is real, it's genuine, and that there's a purpose behind driving the network out across Indian country.
Thank you.
I just want to echo what Loris was saying, that we need the federal government to fully recognize and respect tribal sovereignty when we're talking about internet access issues or generally infrastructure issues, that the power should be in the hands of tribal governments to be able to build out their own infrastructure and to also be able to run their own digital inclusion programs. We shouldn't have people from outside the community coming in to run those. So it's both tribal sovereignty and community support. I'd say those are the major things right now moving forward.
Thank you. Sally, any thoughts?
Yes, I think am I still muted? No, okay. I think for us, there's a few things, and they're not in any particular order. And one is we would like to widen our geographic reach out onto the land, and especially for mental health and healing programs. And people would still like to be connected, but sometimes if they're out on the land, it's a better space. Our communities our reserves are very, very small, postage stamps, some of them. And in order for us to extend our geographic reach out onto the land, we need access to spectrum, which we do not have. Well, we could have if we were willing to spend a pile of money to make sure that the business case for the big telcos could be met. They could get their return on investment in 3 years. That's not going to happen with a population of 1,200 people in a community. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that First Nations communities are poised to set an example here and show leadership in how they are energizing their internet capability. We've seen wonderful examples in some of the communities where they're completely hopscotching over fossil fuels and they are using wind, they are using solar. That needs to be supported. I'd like to see a lot of money go in that direction. The third thing is, it's very, very important that a community understand that when the internet arrives on their doorstep, that they have policies in place, they have a community standard established in place that is going to protect that community. And that's where Western James Bay, we've reached out to the youth and said, okay, you are the people here who are guarding the community. You are guarding the elders. You're teaching the 40 and 50 somethings how to use this technology. So we're investing a lot of time and effort there. So yes, so there's skills training needs to take place. The community needs to understand the dangers inherent in the internet and the good things that the internet can provide. And yeah, we need access to spectrum. And I think we're poised to show a lot of leadership in the area of how the internet can be energized in a good way.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question in the chat. I'll read it out, and anyone who wants to answer it, please go ahead. An increasing interest is developing a non-English internet. The internationalized domain names, or IDNs, and universal acceptance has become a priority, for example, in ICANN's strategic plan. Does anyone on the panel have examples of proactive interventions in pushing for First Nations languages on the internet?
No happy, itam happy, oh happy ya totani. Yes, absolutely. So from Native Public Media, we push obviously Native tribal languages on our network, on the radio network, but also on social media and other internet-based platforms. For example, EBB was mentioned. We helped the New Mexico Department of Education post EBB messaging in the Navajo language. They have one of the largest populations in the state of New Mexico. And we also did several campaigns. We did a voting campaign over our airwaves on social media, both in English and tribal languages. We also did a census drive across tribal homelands. We did COVID-19 and now the vaccination. A lot of these are in English and in tribal languages. So definitely, most tribal communities prefer to have both. There are some communities where they're tribal language speakers only, especially among the elders. And if the messaging is in the tribal language, there's a greater trust in the messaging than it would be in English. And our reach is very hyperlocal. And so if there's someone that can speak Tlingit or Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, or Hopi or Navajo, Zuni, we try to reach out to those communities to make sure their messaging is in their tribal language.
Thank you. I do know in Canada, at least, there was some interest for Inuktitut and Cree syllabic characters for internationalized domain names. I don't know the status of that yet. There's also a fair amount of interest that we've been hearing around the next round of new generic top-level domains, GTLDs. We've been approached by a couple of groups who have some very strong interest in applying for new GTLDs.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite amazing. It'd be very cool. Are there any questions from the participants? Jonathan, please.
Thanks. Jonathan Zook here. I'm vice chair of the ALAC and your moderator of the overall session, master of ceremonies, I guess. I have a question. There's been a lot of discussion during this session about what's unique about the demands and requirements and challenges of tribal communities. But I don't come away from the session clear on what makes those challenges and requirements unique vis-a-vis other rural communities that exist in both the United States and Canada. What is it that makes both, I guess, the requirements, the demands, et cetera, for internet access and the challenges that you face? I know some of that to do with sovereignty, different than other rural communities within North America.
Jonathan, as MC, how much time do we have? Because this could go for a very long.
4 minutes.
I'll jump on that, Mark.
I mean, I
Yeah.
can as well too.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind jumping on that one, Mark, just briefly. I think it goes back to why do we want to hear from First Nations? Why do we want to hear from Indigenous people? What is the value in hearing from them? Okay, so it goes back to that. The fact that Jonathan is asking that question has really set me back on my heels, because there's obviously a lot of education that needs to take place. Yeah. So what would the world be like if everybody spoke English? That's the question. Okay, so the value of bringing Indigenous people on stream is to make our society a better society. And there is value in the Cree language. The Cree language encompasses so many ideas and stories and thoughts that needs to be brought into the conversation. We are a better society because we have different languages. This is what makes us who we are. And like, for example, the first thing we're going to do once fiber to the home is deployed is we are going to start a Cree language TV channel in our communities so that people can take part in that. So anyway, that's my reason. I mean, if you want us to all be the same, that's fine. You know, maybe we'll all die and be robots, but that is not what is happening here. We have a chance to fully enrich our society by bringing Indigenous voices to the table and allowing them to be heard.
And maybe I can restate my question. We don't have a lot of time. I certainly wasn't trying to say, why should we care? What I was trying to say is the challenges you face in getting, let's start with the assumption that the need exists for broadband access. That's without question. Remote healthcare, cultural exchange, language, et cetera. I think those are a given. My question is, are the challenges you face in accomplishing that objective different than those of other rural communities? And are the requirements, the technical requirements that you have from those services in some way different than they are in other rural communities? That's more the question I was trying to get at. It wasn't why do you want this? Because I agree completely. I guess I'm getting at this notion of whether or not what makes what makes this the biggest challenge for you is the remoteness of various communities, or are there other challenges that make this uniquely difficult? Does that make more sense?
So this is Morris, if I could jump in. I think part of it is jurisdictional, and that's a really, really good question. Years ago, when I was starting out, must have been in the 2005 or 6 year, I visited the Arizona State Governor's office and wanted to have a conversation about how we could get broadband out to tribal lands, primarily because the funding at the time was funneled through the state to tribes. We didn't have a separate track then. What I learned from that visit, and you can imagine all the state agencies that were present, they put up a list of priorities. And the list was quite long. I can tell you there were about more than 50 priorities of internet and broadband related items. Tribes never made it on the list. And that's a severe jurisdictional and stark realization for us. I came away from that meeting knowing that tribal lands will remain dark unless we change the scales so that we had more parity at the table. That started really the advocacy from Native Public Media. We immediately went to Congress and said, listen, you can give money to states, but you need a separate track for tribes because the jurisdiction of the state, albeit that they have great needs themselves, leaves tribes at the bottom of the line, or we remain invisible. We remain dark. So I think part of it is jurisdictional, a huge part. We're slowly beginning to see the federal relationship change in that way. We're now having direct funding come to tribes. We even have the EBB is direct funding to consumers. I mean, imagine that wasn't even something that we could have thought was something that could happen 10 years ago. So I think there are questions about tribes also have political standing. We are sovereign nations and as citizens of sovereign nations, we're not considered as one of, in some places we still are, but we don't fall in neatly into that quote minority box. We're separate because we have political standing, and tribes have control not only over their lands, but over their peoples and their resources. And that requires a different kind of conversation between tribal nations and the federal government.
Thank you, Loris. Thank you, everyone. I think we're out of time, but this was an excellent discussion. Thank you, each of the panelists. You each brought a great perspective, and I think this told a great story. And back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks for all of the speakers for this very informative session. It's certainly something that not everyone thinks about every day. So I'm glad it was a session as part of this program. Next up in our agenda here is a discussion about a secure and stable internet. As the COVID-19 crisis has led to massive increases in the use of the internet because of everything becoming remote, obviously, remote work, remote education, remote medicine, all the things that we imagined as the possible on the internet were forced to become a reality, some with more success than others. And it's caused many to question the level of security and stability and availability of the internet to serve the purposes that we always imagined it would serve. And so to head up our panel is Pablo Rodriguez, who is an executive vice president at the Puerto Rican top-level domain, and will be leading a great panel of conversants on this topic. So without further ado, since we'll roll right in, I'll hand the talking stick over to Pablo Rodriguez. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It is a real pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to be here. That previous session on tribal connectivity solution was electrifying, and undoubtedly it showed that this connectivity matters, that the internet matters, and lives are at stakes. Language, identity, and so many other things are so intrinsic and related to who we are and what our needs are. Consequently, one of the things that we need to ensure is that our internet is secure and is stable. As such, consequently, we have a panel of distinguished members of our community. We have Michael Palash, who is a friend for many years and who is well known to our community. We also have Rhonda Silva, who served our community for many years, has been an ICANN board member. And in addition to that, we have Thomas Barrett, or as we call him, Tom Barrett, who has been involved in our community in a number of different positions. So the first question that comes to mind is, gentlemen, how your professional career led to your internet governance. Was it by choice? Was it by design? How do you guys get here? Give us a little bit, a brief background on who you are and what you have done and where you're going.
I guess I'll go first. Thank you, Pablo. Actually, totally by accident. And I even pulled up the specific, I could actually give you a date. It was October 1st, 1994. I had read an article in Wired magazine called Billion Registered, written by Joshua Quintar, who talked about his ability to register McDonald's.com. And I was a law student at the time, working at a law firm. I found this totally amazing. I wrote to him at ronald@mcdonalds.com. I wish I would have saved that email. I did not. Could have made a cool NFT perhaps. But anyway, I wrote to Joshua and I was like, this is amazing. There seems to be no rules. And he actually put me in contact with Phil Sparborough, who was litigation counsel for then Network Solution, who probably has been one of the more inspirational legal people in my career, who has guided a lot of my thinking in things. And that started it. I then read the green paper, the white paper, decided to become one of the first 37 ICANN accredited registrars, became the chair of the registrar constituency, did a 3-year term on the ICANN board of directors, 2003 to 2006. And yeah, so 23 years. I believe my first ICANN event was in December of 1998. So yeah, what happens if I did not pick up that magazine and where my life would have gone is kind of interesting. So,
thank you, Mike. Ron, how about you?
Yeah, it was interesting hearing that, Michael. I kind of approached internet governance from a slightly different path. My career has been in the service provider side, and operators, obviously they need IP addresses to build networks. So in building networks, became an interest of mine to get involved in ARIN, being here in North America, and how addresses are allocated and managed and the policies governing them. So I jumped in probably the late 90s after initially doing a stint in the IETF. I realized, there's all this numbering stuff happening over here. So I jumped into ARIN. I sat on the advisory council for 6 years. I chaired it for 5 of those years. I stepped away for a bit, to focus on my career, came back again later to join the ASO, which was my introduction to the ICANN space, and sort of, went from protocols to numbers. Now I'm going to naming, and began to understand, the issues, the players, the dynamics of what's happening in the namespace. And as one of the functions of the ASO is to appoint to the board members. After sitting on the ASO for 5 years, I took the support of my colleagues to fill the position that was previously occupied by Ray Polzak, who was the CEO of ARIN back when I was on the AC. So, sort of like followed in his footsteps there. I spent the last 6 years in ICANN, and sort of extended my purview into the namespace. So I've kind of done. I always hear that, right? There's the protocols, numbers, and names, and I've kind of done a stint in all three. And along that way, naturally expanded my interest in involvement across governance for internet resources and technology, not only professionally but also just interest in the governance space in general.
Thanks. Hey, Tom, tell us about your experience.
Hey, Pablo, and happy to be here today. I also came through a slightly different path. I'm an engineer by training. I used to run services on something called Prodigy and CompuServe back in the 90s.
Yeah.
So I was hired by a unit of Thomson Reuters to build a new platform to do trademark research. And in 1995, the World Wide Web happened. And of course, we pivoted and built it on the web. And at that time, it was clear that domain names, which were really facilitated via the web browser, was going to be the next brand identifier for brand owners. And so we quickly became heavily involved in the domain name space, mining the WHOIS data from Network Solutions. We actually launched our own corporate registrar for a while in the 90s. I ended up leaving. I ran NetNames for a while. I crossed paths with Michael. I think we both helped launch Affilius back in the day. I launched my own business in 2001. And of course, I've been involved in ICANN ever since. Also involved in some of the initial green paper meetings back in the late 90s. But nowadays, what's fascinating is, I focus on regulated, restricted top-level domains. So we're the top seller for .bank and .cpa and .realtor. And so they are obviously have very particular concerns about security and stability as part of the brand of their TLDs. And more recently, I've been heavily engaged in blockchain domain names, which is fascinating. While ICANN looks like it's going to take 15 years to launch their second round, blockchain technologies are moving very, very fast and coming up with what ICANN should have come up with in terms of brand identifiers on the blockchain. So fascinating to hear the discussion today.
Indeed, and we have a jam-packed session with a number of topics, some of them very sensitive, and one example of that is the Afrinic issue. And I'd like you guys to share your thoughts on this from the perspective of that situation and that issue as an example of an issue that causes insecurity, instability in the internet. We're not passing judgment. We're not saying whether it's good or bad. We're not pointing fingers. We just want to make sure that we share with our audience how a factor such as this one could be a cause of instability and insecurity in the internet. Any one of you who would like to start talking about that?
Yeah, Pablo, thanks. I'll jump in first. I mean, certainly, I think the biggest operational impact is, this Afrinic is incorporated in the country of Mauritius, and it's the Mauritius courts where this proceeding initially started taking place. And one of the things that the court did is it frees the operating assets. So kind of put all the financial means of the organization on hold, which from an operation standpoint means, do they have money to pay rent? Do they have money to keep their servers and their equipment running? Do they have money to keep staff employed and them, especially in the minute of add in a pandemic? Do they have a way of sustaining themselves and being healthy? So it's sort of like a really big operational risk seeing that, and it raises, I think, a broader question of, well, what happens if a similar debate were to happen in whether it's in Virginia, where Aaron is incorporated, or down in Uruguay, I think is where Ripe is. I mean, where LACNIC is, or Amsterdam, right? Where right, you think about like what happens in these jurisdictions, and are the other RIRs at a similar risk if there were a lawsuit? And are those courts a little more sensitive and aware of the fact that, okay, you can't just completely disrupt the importance of this operation relating to internet stability by freezing all their assets? You can resolve a dispute but still have the organization perform this function that's really giving back and to the community as a whole, and is critical in keeping internet stability in place. So that's kind of I think a broader question that comes out of this that I think we all need to pause and think about. How could this risk be addressed more broadly in the other regions, and also back in Africa? Like, how do you prevent that kind of a disruption from happening again?
Can you briefly tell us, for those who are not familiar with the terms of lacnic, afrinic, and ripe, and so on, what is this? What is afrinic, and what do they do?
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. I guess I was taking some liberties with that, with the acronyms. The internet numbers are managed in a distributed way across the globe with 5 different organizations. So, every device on the internet has to have a number assigned to it, and it has to be unique. And that administration of which numbers belong to whom are managed by these 5 organizations. So Afrinic is the organization that runs that database for the greater continent of Africa. RIPE is the organization that manages that for Europe and Russia and part of the Middle East. And Aaron runs that for North America, except for the Spanish-speaking countries. LACNIC operates that for all Latin America, and then the APNIC runs the rest of the balance, which is pretty broad region of Oceanic, Asia, and sort of like South Asia. So yeah, those are the acronyms I was throwing around, the organizations associated with those geographies.
Thank you. And they are also, as an acronym, they call them RIRs, which are the regional internet registries. Thank you, Ron. Mike, can you share a little bit of some more? Can you complement some of that issues that Ron were talking about?
Yeah, so I think what happens here, again, let's just take this up a level. The issue here is we're dealing with intangible assets that have value. And as a result of that, when these things have value, the free market will seek to extract value out of that. And then there are some times in which that extraction of value can be done in a legal way or perhaps in a non-legal way. And I think, that's, to me, security and stability really comes at it from 2 perspectives. What are the economics? Because as Rod said, if an RIR has its bank account seized and is unable to pay staff and do its work, that creates stability issues. Conversely, from a legal perspective, there are situations, one of the things that happened with .cat a number of years ago was there were some issues where law enforcement came in with guns into the registry offices of .cat. So again, these are important things. And I want to go back to I mentioned Phil Sparborough, the chief litigation counsel for Network Solutions and then VeriSign. One of the early interesting conversations I had with Phil was I was sitting in his office in 505 Huntmar Drive, and I said, Phil, what do you do when you have different courts in different jurisdictions telling you to do different things? Like, that seems incredibly complex. And he leaned back in his chair and he's like, Mike, he goes, that's the most easy of questions to answer. And I was like, I leaned forward and I said, yes, what is it? He goes, which court could put your CEO in jail? I was like, wow, okay, that does make that very, very simple and very interesting. And I think getting back to this legal and economics, I told you that my involvement with domain names was back in 1994. I often joke around with John Berryhill that we're dinosaurs because we were involved in domain name disputes when they were still free. They did not cost anything. You just said, I would like it. And then they said, here it is. We have a contract. It's yours. So just stop and think about that. There was a time when domain names were free. Now, obviously, they have value. And so I think that economic aspect is very important when looking at security and stability, particularly in the context of what has been happening, not only with the Afrinic, but also some of the actions that have been involved with Aaron taking certain enforcement actions to what they have perceived violations of their laws. And the last final point that I would make here to show you why law is so important, one of the issues that, I specifically use the term intangible assets. I didn't call it a property, didn't call it a service. There are many people that like to label these things property or services, and the labeling of that has significance. One of the reasons why the greatest body of law on this issue of domain names being a service, and again, Aaron, I think benefits by their location in the Virginia metro area, is the courts have generally there have been a number of courts that have recognized domain names as a service contract. Ron, I think you could perhaps talk to this. I know Aaron views IP addresses as a service contract and not as an asset. So these, as much as we want to talk about security and stability from a hardened, engineering perspective, there are actually economists and, sadly to admit, lawyers that are probably having a greater threat to the long-term security and stability of the internet.
Those pesky lawyers, we always have to keep an eye on them. Tom, tell us, what do you think are some of those factors on this Afrinic issue?
Well, I think that there's two general characteristics that come to mind. One is predictability. The other one is artificial scarcity, right? And so a big part of this controversy is because there's a limited number of IPv4 addresses. If you go to IPv6, the economic value changes dramatically because that artificial scarcity goes away. And so the internet will, given the lack of predictability, and we can talk about how slow ICANN has been, for example, in doing its second round, but given the lack of predictability, it will find a way around it, right? It's not going to wait for standards to be developed or laws to be written. It's going to move forward in spite of that. And so I think it's key here that from an internet governance perspective, we, in a sense, eliminate this artificial scarcity, get them moving on to IPv6, and give them some sense of predictability so they're not whipsawed by people finding loopholes, essentially, in their regulations and policies that they hadn't thought of.
Let me ask
Pablo.
you. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, can I just respond to a little bit of what Tom said?
Please do.
Because it made me think of another dynamic here that I think is interesting, and it's this. I mean, just talking about scarcity, Tom. Early on, a lot of the policies around who gets which addresses and how many were driven by need. So there was a requirement to specify, I'm an operator, I'm an end user or whatever, or a university, and I need a bunch of space, and here's how I'm going to use it, and this is why I'm justified in that need. So there's always been sort of this undertone, and I think the industry pivoted, right? So talking about scarcity, when V4 started to be depleted and the free space available to give out to new operators or existing operators as they expanded became, it started constricting, it put value on it. And I think there was a bit of a pivot, right, in sort of the psyche of what's happening in the policy space away from, hey, if you need it, you can have it, but if you don't need it, you shouldn't have it, to, oh, this has value, I want it because I need it because I want to make money off of it, right? So that's a pretty significant psyche change that happened in the industry. And, I think one thing, Afrinic being one of the later organizations to begin managing addresses for Africa meant they didn't have as many as the other organizations. A big chunk of Africa being behind the rest of the world in getting access to end users and getting broadband in place meant some of their demand for addresses were behind the demand of the rest of the world. So there's this already sort of, I would say, a characterization of a broader or a greater or, a bigger need in Africa, the potential for what they need to do when all of Africa is on broadband, right? Which is not being served in the same way as the rest of the internet was served 10 years ago, when there was this conservation philosophy of, look, if you need it, you can have it. If you don't need it, you're not going to get it. So today, where it's, hey, it has value, I want it, so I can sell it to somebody else, is kind of contrary to addressing the needs of Africa. So one thing Afrinic was trying to do in this situation is, right, their policies are still, if you need it, you can have it, but if, for the use within Africa, but if you don't need it, then you shouldn't have it, right? And I think part of the debate in this was that difference in philosophy or policy, in Afrinic believing that these are resources that need to go to the to the broader market within Africa as they try to grow and catch up to the rest of the internet world. They have a very small amount of E4 addresses available. Yes, it has market value. You can sell that for $50 a IP address in North America, but that means everybody in Africa is going to be disenfranchised because those resources are not going to be available for them to grow. So that's like another dynamic that's at play. That this whole concept of well, if you don't need it and you have it, then maybe it should be reclaimed. There's an idea. You want to get rid of the scarcity market? If somebody's trying to sell it, if they couldn't sell it because they don't need it anymore, it had to go back to the pool and it was fairly distributed, that would probably fix all those issues. But there's no interest in the industry because it's scarce, it has value. Nobody is motivated to do the right thing and give it back. Instead, they want to take it and sell it to somebody else and make a quick buck. So there's this weird dynamic at play in the market, which is very, very different than 20 years ago when initial IP, address administration and philosophy was kind of manifested.
And just to add on to that, if a IP address is an asset that could be sold, why would that be treated any differently than a domain name that I acquire? I have no use for it, but I think I can sell it. There's an entire industry built up about selling domain names. Why should IP addresses be any different?
This discussion serves as an excellent segue to discuss inclusion in internet governance for infrastructure organizations such as ICANN or ISOC, the regional internet registries, and it also fits well with the multi-stakeholder model. How do you see this taking place, and how does it affect in a way that it can ensure that secure and stable internet? Who would like to jump on that one?
I'll take the lead on that one, Pablo. So I guess I'm going to continue my theme of economics. And I'll try to always, this will be the recurring Pelage theme throughout today's panel discussion. So what's interesting is I look at the good work that ICANN, ISOC, and the RIRs have done. And while they all have done a lot of good work, I think that there's different ways in which they have gone about doing it. I think there's some similarities and some differences. But the one thing that I think is important to look at is the money. Doing the right thing does not come cheap. It takes money. So, let's start with ICANN. So Ron, I think, you've just stepped down from the ICANN board. I think the annual budget right now was around 140 plus or minus a couple of million. My first year on the ICANN board, I believe the budget was either 4 or 8 million. And by the time I stepped down in 2006, I think it had gotten to, I believe, 16 million. So again, just stop and think. 4 million was probably not even cover the travel expenses with ICANN meetings. And again, I'm going to try to keep this pretty light here. Mike Roberts, who is the original CEO of ICANN, I believe I believe the second ICANN meeting, ICANN 2, which was Berlin, which was the first that I attended, I believe he put part of that meeting on his own personal credit card because ICANN did not have the funds at that time. They were literally operating on loans because they had zero revenue. So a lot has changed. Now, what has ICANN done with the substantial sums of money which it has extracted from the domain name community? I think it has put, one of the things that I think that does not get the proper attention is the translation services. I think ICANN has really done an excellent job in translation and trying to make its work available to more people in more languages. You look at what they have done with ALAC and trying to bring people, funding different people that may not otherwise have been able to attend an ICANN meeting. So the economics of what ICANN has done with its resources, I think is interesting, and how they have, I think, been held accountable by the community in making sure that investment is done. Switching over to ISOC, I was involved with the affiliates team, Hal Lupson, Ram Mohan, and Roland LaPlante, who work with Lynn St. Amour and David Maher in putting in the bid for .org, right? And back then, ISOC's financial situation was not dire, I think, is the best way to look at it. And you look at what ISOC has done now, how they're funding the IETF, the investments that they're doing with their action plans, some of the good work that PIR has done. All of those good deeds cost money. It does not come for free. There is a limit to how much one can volunteer. So I think, as I look at this in the different business models, and Ron, maybe I could turn it over to you, because I do not know a lot about the specificities. I know at a high level how some of the RIRs work. I know they are very community driven. They start locally and then they circulate. And one trivia question here, Rana, and I'll turn it over to you. Do you know how many lines in the ICANN bylaws are actually attributed to the ASO?
How many lines now? I have no idea. I mean, it's not a lot.
15. and the reason I say that is this is an example. I think, Pablo, some of the discussions with the AFRINIC is, do people need to step in? Does ICANN need to take a role? Answer to that question, in my opinion, no. The RIRs have done a very good job, I think, of handling their internal matters. I think they have a very lightweight agreement, even lighter weight than, say, CCTLDs. And I think that is, again, a proper approach. There is not a one size fits all to internet governance. And I think that would, I'll stop there and turn it over to Rod, and maybe you could expand on your experience with the RIRs.
Maybe just, Michael, to kind of follow on what you were trailing off with, the intersection between the RIRs and the ASO and ICANN. You're right. There's not a lot in the bylaws. It just basically says there should be an ASO, right? So there are two main documents that govern the relationship between the RIRs and ICANN. One is ICANN operates the IANA functions. What are the IANA functions? Well, that is sort of like the top level database of which protocols belong to which numbers, right? So that kind of serves the IETF. At a high level, which blocks of addresses belong to those 5 RIRs. So I talked about earlier them being geographically dispersed. Well, the IRs collectively hire ICANN to maintain that information in what's known as the IANA database, so that it's clear, hey, these blocks belong to North America, these blocks belong to Europe, these blocks are to RIPE, these blocks belong to AFRINIC, et cetera. So there's that component. And similarly, right, ICANN runs the root. Who is responsible for .com or .name or .info or .whatever, right? They kind of run the top level database of namespace and who's authoritative for those, who's the operator, right, for each of those namespaces. But then the other direction, the RIRs collectively come together and say, hey, your bylaws describe this thing called the ASO. Like you said, Michael, it's 15 lines. We'll do that for you, right? So here's how we're going to put together a body of people and some governance around how they operate and perform. And we'll use that as a way to fulfill what's described in the ICANN bylaws as the ASO. So that's sort of the two-way interconnection between the numbering community and ICANN.
Yeah,
Interesting.
just to jump in, I don't have a lot of expertise in this area, but my sense is that there will be some people who will try to expand ICANN's remit, and the scope just keeps getting bigger and bigger. I would certainly advocate for ICANN not trying to expand what's under its umbrella, but supporting these other organizations and what they're trying to accomplish. I think that'd be much more efficient than trying to have ICANN take it on itself.
Gentlemen, you have touched on a number of issues such as DNS, IPv4, access technology investments. Can we briefly explore a comparison and contrast between the RIRs and ICANN, and how can these dependencies on the broadband, as we saw in the previous session, I mean, these are major issues because it affects lives. It affects the way, the quality of life of communities, of nations, and the insecure and instability of the internet literally affects the way people live, and it can live, and it threatens the livelihood of many people. So what are these investments and this broadband access? How can ICANN and the RIRs are working on that? And what is your take on it? How do you see this improving that secure and stable internet?
So you want to go first, Ron, or?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Mike, I'll I guess a couple of things that come to mind, Pablo. One, I mean, especially with respect to broadband, right? So that's kind of close to my heart, and thinking about, half the world that's still not on broadband, and how do we get there? And even here in North America, we have big areas in the region that are still on dial-up or have a mobile device.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, we saw in the previous session that there are tremendous extensions of land in the U.S. and which you would expect that the U.S. is leading the world in terms of communications, and there are a number of rural places, including Puerto Rico, that do not have broadband. So please go ahead.
You're lucky if you got exactly. You're lucky if you get enough bandwidth on your mobile when you're running around. So I mean, that's a real problem. It's a real problem here in North America. It's a real problem globally. And so how does that intersect with the RIRs or with ICANN? Well, fundamentally, broadband requires networking infrastructure. Networking infrastructure requires numbering resources. So, we talk about scarcity, and the whole internet is not on V6 today. So if you had only V6 for your broadband connection, there's a big chunk of the internet that you would still not access. So there's a whole transition issue that's still at play, which is how do we get everybody off of V4 and onto V6? That would certainly address the whole scarcity issue, but we're not there yet. Meanwhile, you need V4 and V6, possibly some translation services to help bridge some of that. So there's some technical tricks to maybe help mitigate that, but you still need some IPv4 to be able to talk to the rest of the world. And here in the U.S., current administration is dumping a ton of government money into trying to help stimulate broadband for rural parts of the country. But what happens later when they go to turn it on and they don't have addresses, or they have to spend a ton of money trying to get it away from somebody who's got a big pile that they've stockpiled for years and don't need, and they're just waiting to monetize it. What happens in the namespace if just tie it into security, right? That's the other thing that I concern myself with is you get the broadband, and then you got these new people on the internet who are vulnerable, and then you got all these abuse issues, whether it's phishing or malware or whatever, and people hiding in certain namespaces, and maybe registrars who are turning a blind eye to it, and you got all this nefarious activity going on tied to certain parts of the namespace. So you got scarcity of E4 to get on there, and then once you're there, you got all this abusive behavior. So it just kind of makes it ripe for governments to want to step in, right? It's a challenge for us as an industry. Are we doing a good job self-regulating? Is our governance of our resources going well, or are we creating these vulnerabilities where there are the haves and have-nots for numbering resources, and then there's abuse and end users that's just kind of will invite, I think, governments to want to go, ooh, this is really broken. People are being taken advantage of. People are being abused or becoming victims of crimes, and we need to step in and fix. Clearly the industry doesn't know how to do administration of a scarce resource. Clearly they don't know how to manage security in a good way. So us, government needs to come in and protect the consumers. That's the risk, right? And that's sort of the balance I think of when you start talking about stability and security of the infrastructure, and how that ties into broadband and our ability to deploy it, and how that might magnify yet even more the issues that we see today, and invite possibly governments to want to come in, quote unquote, fix what we're unable to do ourselves.
Mike?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think you're right, Ron. Part of what ICANN is about is educating what it does, and more importantly, what it doesn't do. And with regard to that infrastructure and broadband and IPS, that is where delegating, the fact that ICANN has delegated that responsibility to the RIRs, I think is appropriate. And part of ICANN's mission should be reminding the rest of the community about that delegation. And it's important, you talk about, security and stability. So here's another a late trivia question for Glenn. When did the term security and stability first appear in the ICANN bylaws? Answer, circa 2003, after 9/11. 9/11, people do not realize how transformative that was to ICANN and the broader ICANN community. That is when governments began to realize, wow, this is critical infrastructure. A significant portion of our GMP is associated with it. And those numbers, those percentages have only gone up since 2001. So I think that is, I think that's important. And to Ron's point there, when something goes wrong, right? This is where people say, I need to fix it. And for legislators that have hammers, everything that they look at is a nail, and they want to fix it with their hammer. So part of, I would say, ICANN's mission is educating people and the broader community about what it can do and what it can't do, and setting expectations. So I think that's all part of delegating. I think this is what ICANN has begun to do, I think, in the broader context of DNS abuse. I can tell you this concept of abuse was first raised when I was on the board, and it was like outside of our remit, no way. But now it's kind of like, yeah, we need to, I don't want to say own it, but ICANN at least needs to be facilitating an intelligent discussion about it so that the appropriate people can handle that. And I think that is the challenge.
Thanks. Tom?
Yeah, no, I don't have much more to add to this. I like Michael's trivia question. I propose another one, which I'm not sure the answer, but I think it's the last. The slogan of ICANN is security, stability, and a single interoperable internet. That last piece is probably the last piece added to their mission. And I know we'll get more into this later, but that was in response to governments thinking about setting up their own route back in the day. And that topic has raised its head again.
Thanks, Tom, because that is an excellent segue to the next question, in which I would like to know the root zone as a primary mechanism for a single shared route and preventing namespace collision. How does the evolution of DNS impact the fundamental principle of a single shared namespace? For example, different applications running on the same computer are more commonly getting different answers from the DNS. Would you, how do you see that?
Yeah, I can take that a little bit. I'm pretty active on the SACS name collision advisory council, and so they looked at this issue extensively back prior to the first round. And as you know, back then, they found there's a lot of collision going on with corporate networks. In fact, so much so for 3 strings, corp, mail, and home, that they decided, although there were probably 8 to 10 applicants for each one of those, they decided not to delegate those at all. But interestingly, the 90% of the other strings that were applied for had collisions as well. And so the solution back then was to do something called controlled interruption and give warning basically to those collisions, saying we're going ahead with this delegation, so you should fix what you have. The problem has continued; it hasn't gone away. So the NCAP group is gearing up again and looking at the problem. And what's going on is the DNS is evolving, and people are trying to find ways to make it more efficient, more localized, and the preconceived notions of everything you can measure at the root tells you what's going on is no longer true, because it's now getting even more distributed than it was before.
Ron, would you care?
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing that I think creates confusion, if you take us technologists and stick us aside, because we probably understand the difference in alternate namespaces, but for like an end user who may be sitting, who's not in this industry, they're in a completely different sector, who's sitting here on their laptop or their computer or their phone or whatever, if there's a namespace that looks like a domain name, you know, thing.object.word, right? So it's a bunch of letters, maybe recognizable names or objects separated by periods. A lot of people go, oh, that's a domain name. I can just stick it in my browser and I'll go to the website because DNS will tell me how to get there. But if that same structure, that sort of namespace structure is used with other protocols, and I'm kind of walking up to the idea of, hey, if you look in some of the blockchain technology, that kind of nomenclature can be found, but it's not DNS, right? And somebody outside of the space, somebody who's not a practitioner might go, oh, that must be a DNS name. So if I've got, you know, .NASIG, use today's 5-letter acronym as an example, that means one thing in the global DNS infrastructure. That means, you know, there's that string stuck in a root zone and it's assigned by ICANN to be, you know, run and operated by a particular registry who's, you know, authorized to operate that and populate information into that top level for DNS purposes. But somebody else might stick it and have, you know, cool stuff.nasig in some other, you know, place, whether it's on my phone in an app, you know, and I just put that in. Now suddenly I think, oh, that must be DNS, but it's not. It's actually just a string that's being used by the app to get information and present it in a way that maybe you would normally get by sticking it in your browser and resolving it with DNS and getting information. So that kind of parallel use and sort of the end user not really getting the difference that, oh, this is just app specific, resolution versus this is using this global DNS thing to resolve this string to give me some values. They're very different, but they look the same. They can create a lot of confusion. And this is like, Tom, you talked about some of the classic ones that kind of came out of companies' IT best practices of, let's use, .corp or .home as examples locally and have all kinds of local values to it and create your own, information about it, but not leak it out to the rest of the global internet, right? I think we have that same type of collision coming with strings that look like DNS, but are not, but being used in apps or other technologies. So that's kind of an interesting topic.
Thanks, Ron. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so just to kind of wrap this up and maybe tie in both Ron and Tom's comments, perhaps being one of the dinosaurs here, I've been around to see this before. And my specific recollection would be 2001, there was only 7 test beds that were selected out of the 49 applicants. And Idea Labs decided to come in with a plugin that would allow for, an alternate expanded namespace. I think what Idea Labs was trying to do at that time, it's not on all fours with what some of what I would call the alternate naming schemes are trying to do. Some of them are also perhaps more well financed. But I think one of the things I would point to instead of an either or, I was actually involved in a presentation in ICANN 60 in Abu Dhabi. It was a joint meeting of the ICANN board and the technical experts group. And in this session, it was myself, Pindar Wong, one of the original ICANN board members, and someone from the Ethereum Foundation. And the paper I wrote for that talked about evolution or revolution, right? I think, when I look at blockchain and DLT, I still view it in its infancy. I do not believe that it is as robust as our DNS. That is not saying that can't happen. Again, blockchain just had its 10-year anniversary within the last year or two, if I recall properly. So again, it's a much more, it is not as mature as the DNS. I think it's important that instead of ICANN worrying about, what's this threat or what's that threat, just make its trains run on time. Make sure the DNS that most businesses rely upon for the secure, stable, predictable operations of their business, focus on that. And if there are alternate schemas, that's fine. I tend not to want to pay a lot of attention to it. But I do believe of more of an evolution. I do think there is some value and how that could potentially be integrated into the DNS. And one of the projects that I did work with the Ethereum Foundation, and more specifically with the ENS, I worked with Nick and Brantley on this, was integrating .lux, which was one of the first TLDs to integrate a wallet into it. So I do think that I tend to be more of an evolution as opposed to revolution. And always looking at the glass half full.
Thanks, Mike. So gentlemen, what does the future look like for oblivious DNS, anonymized DNS, and then in addressing a more secure internet? How do you see that? What is your, if you're looking into your crystal ball, what does it look like?
No, I'll take a shot at that. So you are all, I think, accustomed to accessing the internet through web browsers. I think increasingly that's going to change. We already know, for example, if you do anything on the blockchain, be it cryptocurrency or NFTs or even blockchain websites, you have to put in either a special plugin, or you use a special browser, or you use a special app. And so I think increasingly people are going to utilize and access the internet outside of the web browser. And when that happens, they may, as I say, start to see different results from the DNS because they're seeing some sort of distributed DNS or some caching of the DNS. And so that's the future in my mind is when will that adoption accelerate? The story I like to tell, because we're all thinking about, so digital wallets are great if you have some Bitcoin, but it's such a kludgy thing. This is my cold wallet for my cryptocurrency. There's a little USB port on it. I gotta walk around with this if I want to secure it. But there's a whole generation of youngsters who are growing up where having a digital wallet is going to be second nature to them. I did a webcast a few weeks ago for the Trademark Association, and we had on the webcast someone who is working with a doll company. It's the biggest doll company in the world that they sell to young girls. And you collect these dolls like you collect baseball cards or what have you. And they're giving every one of these girls a digital wallet to manage cryptocurrency and NFTs of their collection. And so there's an entire generation of kids who are going to be growing up with being very comfortable with accessing the internet outside of a web browser.
Interesting. Ron, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I guess I kind of took a different reaction to it from where Tom was going. It was really, I think about GDPR and this whole, debate about privacy and, trying to protect the individual's right to be invisible. One of the interesting things about the evolution of the DNS is there's information that's shared with the resolver or the root or recursively through a number of servers as you look to resolve a particular string to get the IP address of the server you want to communicate with. And historically, that information can be farmed or gathered by your service provider or by whoever's running the name services on behalf of the service provider. And then there's these public service providers, DNS operators who have stood up instances over the years, so people can use them rather than the local service provider. But all that just tells me there is data being shared, and at each hop along the way, somebody can glean information of that data. So there's been an effort to how do you secure that so that the end users queries what servers they're talking to, where their potential traffic is going, that can all be hidden and protect the privacy of the end user. So thus the birth of DOE, DNS over HTTP, HTTPS specifically, or oblivious DNS or other mechanisms where you're putting in a layer in between, sort of a proxy or a server that provides a hop to kind of hide your privacy information and act on your behalf so that the broader public, as your queries go out to try to resolve a particular string, that information gets hidden so they don't know who the originator is and where your final destination of information your query is inquiring about. But of course, that just puts another device in the middle that has that same information, right? So now the middleman is who's protecting you accumulates a massive amount of information and maybe starts with the promise of, yeah, we're here to protect you and give you anonymity. And then later they become the source of, okay, well, here's the problem. This middleman now who is providing the services now knows who I am. And so you need sort of an end-to-end. And, that was the idea with DOE. But then it's the server at the other end of the DOE, right? It's using HTTPS to just tunnel your DNS query to some operator who's running the server. And sure, they might today be saying, look, we're going to delete all the information. We're not going to harvest any personal data. We're not going to make any money off of that harvest, yada, yada, yada. But it's there. It could be used. It could be, the company could be sold to somebody else later who has a different philosophy about that. And it's like, you know what? Hey, great, we got all this data, now let's do something about it. So, so I don't know, Pablo, like those technologies, I think they're all trying to solve the same problem, which is the right to be invisible, so that you can operate on the internet. You know, in some places in the world, like that's actually a matter of life and death, right? You don't have the same type of free speech that is here in most of North America, in some parts of the world, and like that becomes an issue. What if you want to express yourself? You can't, right? Because you might be prosecuted, you might be jailed, you might be worse, you might be executed because of what you say or don't say. So those are real life or death things for some people in this international internet we have. And that's the balance, right? How do you get a nice, cool, scalable technology that we have today, but then also overlay some privacy mechanisms? I think we need something. Are these solutions going to be them for the long haul? Yeah, I guess we'll wait to see. It's kind of hard to, from an architectural standpoint, for me to envision something in the middle that's like not going to someday potentially be at risk at being that same, gatherer of data and information. So that's I think the balance that's got to be struck. And I think we'll figure it out, but hopefully sooner, not later.
I was under the impression that we had at least 2 or 3 more hours to talk, but time is running out. And I have a quick question. I just need, please be brief on this because we still have a few more minutes for questions. How does the rising demand for privacy impact visibility, and how does the rising demand for privacy impact visibility into security threats? And is one more important than the other?
I guess I'll go there. I actually think there's a symbiotic relationship. I think as Ron was saying, I think you need to balance the two. I was reading a recent Gartner report that says identity is the new perimeter. I think if you look at where we're going here, I think one needs to balance pseudonymous credentials versus anonymous. I know a lot of people think that anonymity is very important. But to me, anonymity is equated to non-accountability. And if you have anonymity with non-accountability, governments are going to interfere. So the question is, how can we come up with pseudonymized credentials, which enhances privacy, but have some type of, as you say, who is going to be that individual in the middle that will run that black box to determine when that disclosure will happen, recognizing that that disclosure could put certain people or end users' lives at risk. And Ron, just on this, Adobe is working on a project with Microsoft that's called C2PA, I believe. And it's talking about how copyright creators can retain provenance over their creation, yet at the same time protect their privacy, recognizing that a growing number of reporters in the field that are documenting photojournalists are doing it with their phones, right? Are doing it with their phones, and how can they protect their copyrighted material while at the same time protecting their privacy and their life? So that to me, I think, is the interesting challenge. It's not an either or. I think it is that coexistence of identity and privacy. And it's a tough nut to crack, but I believe that's really the important challenge for us as a community to handle.
And just to add to that, there are commercial interests that are aligned themselves in different camps, right? And so there are winners and losers that when you start to have privacy, whereas today the ISP may extract value from your internet activity, they no longer have visibility to that, but now perhaps your browser or someone else does. And so I would not discount the fact that the champions of privacy, for example, could be commercial interests who feel like they have a way to extract economic value from that activity. to the detriment of some other commercial interests.
Thanks, Tom. Ron?
I got a little distracted, Michael, with your reference to the C2PA. So I helped start a startup a couple of years ago called Certified True, doing sort of like the same, trying to solve the same problem, having using blockchain technology to have signatures on, in particular for with dealing with real estate, legal and insurance proceedings, like, provenance around here's some photographic evidence for whether it's a dispute on real estate issues or something, right? That you can hold up in the court of law that says, yeah, this is, because you can doctor, you can modify, you can change things. Sorry. Sorry about that. It happens every time, right? So, so needing to be able to protect the provenance and assure that has not been changed or modified, so that it holds up in the court of law. So that's sort of like the problem space, and it got me thinking, Michael, as you talked about this. Like, oh yeah, I'm very, very familiar with this, and I sit on their board now, but kind of fun.
Gentlemen, thank you so very much for taking the time to share your experiences and expertise with me and the audience. This has been a most fruitful session. I'm so looking forward to seeing you soon face to face and sharing some mojitos in Puerto Rico. So maybe next time. ICANN 73, unfortunately, is going back to virtual. So, but in the meantime, we are going to open up this session for questions. So, Jonathan, do we have more time, or do I have one more hour, or do we open up for questions?
I think a good place to start would be to take some questions. I don't see hands up or questions in the Q&A pod yet. So let's give people an opportunity to raise their hands if they have questions. We have 10 more minutes in the session. I'd like, on behalf of NASIG, to thank all of you for your participation, Ron and Tom and Michael and Pablo, with your great moderation of the session. It's obviously a huge topic that could take an entire conference unto itself, and does regularly around the world. So it's a complicated topic for sure. Are there any questions? Glenn, did you catch any questions in the chat that I may have missed? I'm not sure that I saw. I tried to keep an eye out for them, but I didn't see any. Sally has a question, and I think she's a panelist, so she can just turn on her microphone and ask her a question. Go ahead, Sally.
Yes, I was wondering if someone could speak to something that I've noticed seems to be a problem, and that is when we set up our legislative processes in Canada and in the States, was this done with the legislation of intangible assets in mind? So this is where I think I'm noticing, for example, in the Senate proceedings, that what happened in the States a while back with Facebook, and in Canada with Netflix, is the politicians grappling with how do you apply your legislative practices, which were, devised in the 1700s, to today's situation with the internet, which is largely unseen and intangible. That, I think, is where a lot of the problems are actually starting. So if somebody is thinking about that, or, if has an answer to that or discussion, I'd appreciate hearing it.
I guess, Sally, I don't know if I necessarily have a comprehensive answer. I could give you a couple of data points where you may want to dig a little deeper. From a U.S. perspective, interestingly enough, the U.S. actually did appreciate the intangible nature of at least domain names. In the ACPA, the Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act, that was 99-2000. In that particular piece of legislation, they actually provided an in rem provision so that you actually can bring a legal proceeding in the location of either the registry or the registrar if you can't find the domain name registrant. So I would say in that aspect, the US was rather forward thinking. Some of the other scenarios where the intangible assets, perhaps courts are not as articulate. Perhaps, I guess the way to look at it is they're doing surgery with a chainsaw instead of a laser. It would be, for example, the Quad 9 case that came out of Germany. This was a litigation where Quad 9 was running basically a vetted DNS service. And I believe it was Sony Music went to them and said, we want you to block this from resolving. And they're like, that doesn't meet our criteria for exclusion. It's not spam or malware. So that was involved. Looking north, Sierra, I believe, had intervened in some federal court of appeals involving Gold TV and website blocking. So I guess the simple answer is there is a lot of case law that is evolving about these assets. Unfortunately, in my opinion, I don't think the courts have fully wrapped their arms around the specifics of what they are doing. And I believe there are times in which their rulings could have unintended consequences, which do not enhance the security and stability of the internet. So I guess that's how I would try to answer that question.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. There's also a question from Alfredo here. Do all RIRs follow the same set of rules, norms, contract articles, etc.? How aware are end users of the consequences of any similar legal issues, such as the one found with Afrinic?
Yes, I'll take a stab at that one. I mean, certainly the 5 RIRs operate independent of one another. So no, they don't have the same bylaws. They don't have the same, even the output of their communities are different. The policies that govern how they allocate addresses and to whom, and what they charge on a membership basis. I mean, they're all distinctly different. There is a vehicle though for if there's a need in the numbering community to have a global policy, something that is uniformly dealt with all 5 RIRs, for them to go through and ratify a proposed policy in all their regions, and then kind of identify and recognize it through the ASO, which we talked about at the beginning of the panel. They can use the ASO to validate, look, here's a policy, it's the same everywhere. We can acknowledge this is a global policy, and then kind of appeal to the ICANN board to ask them to validate, hey, we believe this is a global policy and it's been followed the same way everywhere, being implemented the same way. Can you just make sure this is really just an accountability piece? So there's an accountability component from the ASO back to the ICANN board to say, if you don't think we actually followed the right process and this is in fact not a global policy, please let us know. But otherwise, it defaults to being a global policy. So that's probably the only time that you get uniformity across all the RIRs. That said, there are multinational operators who participate in all the different regions, and they will bring forward something that's important to them in the different registries. So you'll see things that are very similar, but they might be implemented a little bit differently or worded slightly differently, and how that's paid for, or what the membership looks like for those resources in the different registries. That's all different as well. So there's definitely differences region by region. End users, I think that was the second half of the question. Do end users know? No, generally no.
That's right.
I mean,
Yep.
I don't know. End users generally don't get involved in numbering resource policy. It's often driven by big operators. A lot of enterprises, the larger ones will depend on their upstreams to give them addresses, or their cloud provider to give them addresses. Or if they're really involved, they'll stand up and participate. But the end users are generally not involved directly. They depend on providers, broadband providers, ideally, who are getting the resources to build the infrastructure to give them access.
I think the Afrinic problem is what led Alfredo to bring end users into the question where they otherwise wouldn't. And is there any greater awareness that would be beneficial for end users, given those kinds of situations can happen?
Yeah, I don't know. I just being involved in the numbering community for a long time. I mean, it's hard enough to get enterprises and operators to show up and participate. There's generally, a fairly small number who come and participate in policy issues. So trying to branch out and get end users involved, I think, I just think about the many times I've sat around family conversations or friends who are not in the industry and tried to explain to them what are these things called internet protocol addresses, and why do they matter, and how does it impact them? I mean, it's always a fun conversation to have, but I don't usually walk away with that, with somebody going, oh, this is really, maybe somebody who's a physician, a friend who's a physician going, oh, that's really exciting. Now, how do I get involved? I'm going to go to the next RAR meeting and voice my concern about the size of the allocations going to the upstream provider that I'm buying broadband from. I mean, it just doesn't happen, right? So, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that bridge would work, or how it would be interesting, or how end users would, kind of get all excited about that.
How do you survive at cocktail parties, Ron? I mean, it's got to be tough with that that body of work that you have to bring to bear on those conversations. I want to thank the panel again. We're going to move on. Obviously, this conversation's just another drop in the bucket of these discussions, but we've reached the end of our time, and we're going to move on to the fun part of our session, where we have a little quiz. And so if you look here on the slide, well, this is not the right thing to share. Can you share your Kahoot screen so that we can show the, you're going to go to kahoot.it and then type in a number. It was pasted in the chat, which we can do again, but it'll hopefully be up on the screen soon enough. But if you go to Kahoot, KAHOOT.IT, and then enter the passcode code 8702204, that's how you can join in the quiz. And you can do that from your mobile device, or from your desktop, or really from any browser that you have access to. So there you go. You can see that it says up here at the top, join at kahoot.it, and then there's the game pin, 8702204. So we'll give you all a chance to join in, and then we'll get the quiz started in just a couple of minutes.
So as we're waiting, hi, everybody, it's Glenn. I have the quiz ready to go. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes, and we can start rolling. Okay, so anybody who has used just your initials or synonyms, you'll have to get back to us. upon completion so that we can make sure we get your prizes. I just want to mention that the prizes are courtesy of .PR. Dr. Pablo Rodriguez was courteous enough to provide the contest prizes from yesterday and today. So I'll turn it over to Jonathan. So let me know when we can start.
Thanks, Glenn. Glenn will be playing the role of Vanna White here on the during the quiz show and making the different questions appear. I'll be reading them out to you. What you'll see on your phone or your browser, wherever you log in, will actually be the colors of the answers. And so the answers will be listed on the screen, and you'll have to hit the corresponding color on your phone or on the browser screen in which you participate. You can certainly join late as you see this is going, but you'll be behind if you do. But if you're feeling particularly confident, feel free to join in the quiz late and start in the middle. It seems this whole effort is a little bit like waiting for popcorn to pop. You want to let it keep going while the pops are happening quickly, and then pull it off the fire when they slow down. It seems as though they've slowed down a little bit, Glenn. So I'd be inclined to go ahead and start the quiz.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, here we go.
So the first question is going to be a practice question, just so that you can get used to it. How many Native American tribes are federally recognized by the U.S. government? So you can see with each of these answers, there is a color associated with it. So red is 574, blue is extinct, yellow is 50, and green is none. So on your phone or in your browser, just click the corresponding color to what you believe answers the question. And then Glenn sometimes plays music while we wait for the timer to... You may not have selected share system sound when you shared your screen, Glenn. There we go. All right, we're counting down here. 4, 3, 2, 1. And we see that it's 574. So that is how the quiz will take. Oh, I guess that wasn't a practice question. We dove right into it, Glenn, this time. Sorry, I misled everyone. So Buck is in the lead with 960 points.
Yahoo!
Very exciting. All right, so next question. Did a dog interrupt Ron's comments? True or false? Blue is true, red is false. Remember, folks, the speed with which you answer the question also gets you more points. So being the first one to answer correctly is just as important as answering correctly, but not more important, as has happened to Judith in the past. Sometimes people answer too quickly and end up getting the wrong answer. So the question is true. As Ron said, it always happens to everyone. I don't know if that's true. Now, hey, Rockney has taken the lead with 1,903 points, putting Buck at the number 2 slot at 1,850. Let's go on to the next question, Glenn. When was a single interoperable internet, Section 16, added to the ICANN bylaws? The red answer, March 12th, 2012. Blue answer, March 10, 2020. Yellow answer, March 11, 2009. Or green, March 2006. When was a single interoperable internet, Section 16, added to the ICANN bylaws? And the answer is March 12th, 2012. That's excellent. What's happening with our leaderboard, Glenn? All right.
Woo-hoo.
Ronnie has taken a healthy lead here. NK has moved up past Buck in the standings. It's a dead heat here in the NASIG race for intellectual superiority. So next, what are all the barriers in tribal broadband adoption? Poor infrastructure, red. Lack of community support, blue. Lack of funding support, yellow. Spare and isolated populations. Glenn, is this one where people can answer more than one?
I believe so.
All right, yes.
I
Choose all that apply here.
and it should be sparse in isolated populations.
Yeah. And here are the primary barriers to tribal broadband adoption: poor infrastructure, lack of funding support, and sparse and isolated populations. Of course, lack of community support is a little bit of a trick answer, because we did learn that one of the most difficult things about promoting community broadband was the community and not the broadband part. So getting people organized and to coordinate to bring something about can sometimes be one of the biggest challenges. NK has a streak with 4 correct answers in a row. NK, you're doing great. We look forward to figuring out who you are. All right, next question. What is DNS abuse? Oh my Lord. Direct numbering system, domain number system, domains neglected sadly, or domains nobody secured? This is a toughly worded question, Glenn.
Mm.
You mean, what is the DNS?
Mm-hmm.
All right. The domain number system? That's not what I've heard the DNS means, Glenn.
Oh, well.
But okay, let's mislead everyone here.
Yeah,
in
indeed,
North American
indeed.
School of Internet Governance.
Indeed.
Because it's North America, we do our best to keep everyone confused. All right. What is the current situation with Afrinic? Business as usual, a legal dispute with customers leading to banking disruption, implementation of new business ventures outside of Africa, or staff expansions? Hit the corresponding color. Nandita, you are NK. Excellent. You're doing great. All right, get your answers in. 5 seconds remaining. All right, and the answer is a legal dispute with customers leading to a banking disruption. What's the leaderboard look like? NK still in the lead, a strong lead at 42-20. You're doing great. Next question.
Last one.
What is
No.
DOH or
No.
DO? Distance over history, domains offered home, dial over HTTP, or DNS over HTTPS. It's also what Homer Simpson says and was recently added as a word in the dictionary, making my parents, the linguistics professors, turn over in their graves. DOH.
Okay.
All right, 5 seconds. Get your answers in. I feel like we have 8 people participating. All right.
And
And
ready?
it is DNS over HTTPS.
Here we go. Here we go.
And how did things turn out? Oh, look at that. Ronnie came out on top with 5 out of 7. And then DNS Conundrum in second place and NK in third, losing their lead after holding it on for so long. Tell us what they've won, Glenn.
I'm not sure. It's Eduardo's job.
All right, or Pablo. Maybe it's Pablo's job.
There
since,
we go.
He's donated the prizes, right?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that there are 3 prizes, and one of them is the first prize is these are all Amazon cards, so you can buy anything in Amazon. It's a $75 US dollars for the first prize. Second prize is $50, and third prize is $25. So make sure we know who you are, because DNS Conundrum, I don't know what that is. I haven't found that. So we can send this via email to all of you, to all the winners. So thank you so much.
It's the conundrum of the domain numbering system, Eduardo.
Especially that.
Alfredo, Eduardo, if you look on the chat, I believe Ron says Ronnie equals Ron. So there he is.
Okay.
Ron De Silva.
Ron De
Shocking
Silva.
that he was able to win this quiz after being one of the panelists and serving on the ICANN board. All right, Eduardo, I think my duties as master of ceremony have completed, and I will hand them in turn over to my master, Eduardo Diaz, the El Presidente of the NASIG School of Internet Governance 2021. Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much. I just want to thank everyone, for especially panelists and moderators, for being here today and spend some time with us in NASIG. This has been an excellent second day event because we drilled down. Again, we went and saw specific challenges from a specific community, like a tribal community in North America, and I think it was eye-opening. Sometimes, we are accustomed to live in places where you see people, and then you see suddenly people that live very, very remotely, and I can see how difficult it will be for them to get connected to the internet and how expensive. But these are real things that people have to have challenges. They have to connect to the internet, and is the purpose of all of us to help to have everybody connected to the internet. And then we got into the instability and the security and stability of the internet, and it was a very interesting information about things that are happening in the internet. I know for some of you that are not that familiar with ICANN, we use a lot of abbreviations, so sorry about that, but I guess you can get the gist of the things, some of the things that can cause instability in the internet and security. But I'm going to allow Alfredo Calderon, which is around here. He will try to wrap up the whole thing since he was getting notes on some of the things. So Alfredo, why don't you tell us a summary from your point of view? Thank you.
Well, I was actually not taking notes. I was chatting and hearing what the conversation was going on. So let me go back to yesterday to give you sort of a sense of what I got. I didn't participate, but I heard the recording early this morning, and actually had some very interesting points from the digital divide and digital inclusion perspective. And they brought forward all those aspects that we believe are challenging if we want to deal with the digital divide or digital inclusion. And the term that came out of the conversation, which I found interesting, was discrimination. Discrimination, is it the same as digital inclusion? Is it the same as digital divide? Or are we actually talking about that we are discriminating between different sectors of our communities via their gender, their economic capacity, or their limited access to broadband in their area where they reside. Today's twist was also very interesting, since we started talking in details of different aspects of how we see the internet as a resilient and trusted platform that all of us are using. And it's interesting that education, from my point of view, education was a high level topic that although the word wasn't used, it came up. And finally, the fact that we, the end users, are not involved usually in policy development is crucial. We need to reach out to the end user. Although they're not technical, they should be aware of the consequences of having an internet presence, of using broadband, and how they can speak or talk to the internet service provider to get what they need, especially when we're talking about IPv6 and IPv4, which Ron and the others have stated that is an issue, because IPv4 is scarce and IPv6 is the future, since there's all these Internet of Things or these devices that need to be connected, and how they communicate between the two IP versions. So that, Eduardo, in a nutshell, is my takeaways from the conversations we've been having the last couple of days. And I just want to encourage everybody, all of the participants and all that watch the recordings, that to reach out to each and every one of the speakers through the website. We have their contact information, we have their presentations. So reach out to them if you have any more questions. And as another point, I would like to invite everybody that is interested in deep diving into some of the aspects or the issues discussed in the last couple of days to look out for the Virtual School of Internet Governance, which is a platform online, completely free, that offers an opportunity for each and every one of you to learn a little bit more about internet governance and how broadband and the internet and the different actors in the internet ecosystem share the burden of establishing policies and regulations and norms. So thank you, Eduardo, and back to you.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank again everyone that took the time to participate and contribute on this event. We will have a NASIG in 2022. We haven't decided what time. We had it planned to go before ICANN 73, which was going to be in March, but as we all know, that's going to be virtual. So. That will change the time in the year that we're going to do NASIG 22. So I hope to see you again around there. We will have a different theme, and this is a way of us providing information and seats to all of you, so you can participate in this thing that is called the internet and anything that governance it. So thank you so much, and with this, the event is being closed. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.